In the last few weeks, two states in the Pacific Northwest have lost more forest than they normally lose in an entire year. In some counts, more than they have lost in any full year ever recorded. And the most frightening part is not how much has burned, it is which forest is burning. Because Oregon and Washington are not supposed to be fire country. Not like this. These are the green states, the rainforest states, the land of moss and fog, and towering Douglas firs that stand in ground so wet that for most of the year you could not light them if you tried. For generations, the forests west of the Cascade Mountains were considered almost fireproof. People called them the asbestos forests. They do not burn. That was the rule. And right now, that rule is being torn apart in real time. But here is what almost no one reporting the acreage is telling you. This is not really a story about drought, or about a hot summer, or even about climate in the abstract. This is a story about a single specific kind of wind. A wind that flips the entire region inside out in a matter of hours, that only shows up on rare occasions, and that turns the wettest forest in the continental United States into the most dangerous. When that wind arrives, everything the Northwest believes about itself stops being true. So the real question is not whether the forests of Oregon and Washington are burning. They are. The question is whether the thing that is burning them is becoming the new normal, and whether the green heart of the Pacific Northwest is being rewritten into something it has never been before. Let me take you into the night this kind of thing begins. It is just after dark in a small town in the western foothills of the Oregon Cascades. The kind of town where the highway is the main street, where the trees come right up to the backyards, and where people have lived their whole lives under a canopy so thick you can barely see the sky. A man named Dave is standing on his porch, and something about the evening is wrong. The air is warm, too warm, and moving the wrong way. In this part of Oregon, the wind almost always comes from the west, off the Pacific, carrying the damp, cool breath of the ocean inland. But tonight, the wind is coming from the east, down off the mountains, and it is dry. It is not a breeze. It is a steady, relentless push, gusting hard enough to bend the tops of 100-foot trees, and it carries no moisture at all. The humidity that was sitting comfortably high that afternoon has crashed. Dave does not have a weather station on his porch, but he can feel it. His lips are dry, the leaves sound like paper. And somewhere up the valley to the east, past the ridgeline, there is a faint orange smudge on the underside of the clouds that was not there an hour ago. He goes back inside. Most people do. There is no alarm yet, no evacuation order, no reason to think that this night is different from any other windy night in the mountains. He checks his phone. Nothing. He goes to bed. By the time the knock comes on his door, the orange smudge is a wall, and it has traveled distances that no wildfire is supposed to travel in a single night. The wind that felt strange on his porch is now driving a fire front across the landscape faster than a person can run, faster in places than a person can drive, throwing embers a mile ahead of itself into forest that has not seen fire in 100 years. Dave has minutes, not hours, minutes, and in those minutes the town he has known his entire life begins to disappear. That is not a hypothetical. That is essentially what happened across Oregon on a single stretch of days a few years ago, and it is the template for what is happening again right now. To understand why it matters so much, you have to understand just how far outside the normal this really is. In a typical year, the entire state of Oregon might lose a few 100,000 acres to wildfire, and most of that burns in the drier forests and rangelands to the east, where fire has always been part of the landscape. That is the baseline. That is normal. A bad year pushes higher. A quiet year stays lower. But the system, over a full 12 months, tends to land in a range that people have come to expect. Now compress that. Imagine losing not a few 100,000 acres over a year, but around 1 million acres in roughly 72 hours. Imagine a fire season's worth of destruction, several fire seasons worth, arriving not over months, but over a long weekend. That is the scale we are talking about. That is what it looks like when the west side forests go up. Because when they finally burn, they do not burn like the dry pine country. They burn all at once, with a violence that the drier forests almost never reach. And this is where you have to throw out everything you think you know about a forest fire. Because the forests of the Western Cascades are a completely different kind of machine, west of the Cascade Crest. The Pacific Northwest grows some of the densest, tallest, most water-heavy forest on the planet. Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, trees that climb 200, 300 feet into the air. standing in a tangle of ferns and moss and rotting logs that hold water like a sponge. These forests get drenched for 8 or 9 months of the year. The ground is often soaked. The living trees are full of moisture. For most of the calendar, this is genuinely one of the hardest landscapes in the country to burn, and that is exactly why so many people built their lives inside it without ever fearing fire. But that same abundance is a trap, because all of that lush growth over centuries produces enormous amounts of fuel. Fallen trees, deep layers of dead needles and branches, dense stands packed tighter than any dry forest would ever allow. In a dry pine forest, small fires burn through every so often, clearing the underbrush, keeping the fuel load low. That is a forest that fire visits regularly and gently. The wet west side forest is the opposite. Fire almost never comes, and because it almost never comes, nothing ever clears the fuel. It just accumulates, decade after decade, century after century, into a colossal reservoir of stored energy sitting quietly under all that moss. These forests do not burn often, but when the conditions finally line up, they do not burn small. They burn once every few generations, and when they do, they release everything they have been storing the entire time. A wet forest that has skipped 100 years of small fires is not safe. It is loaded. It is the difference between a candle and a bomb, and the fuse for that bomb is the wind. So let me show you exactly what that wind does, because this is the mechanism at the center of the entire disaster. Most of the year, the Pacific Ocean runs the show in the northwest. Air flows from the cool ocean inland, and it arrives moist, mild, and stabilizing. It is the reason the region is green. But on rare occasions, usually in late summer and early fall, the pattern reverses. A dome of high pressure builds inland, to the east, over the high deserts of the Great Basin, and the air begins to flow the other way, from the dry interior toward the coast. That reversed wind has to get over the Cascade Mountains to reach the western valleys, and as air descends the western slope of a mountain range, it does two things that are catastrophic for fire. It compresses, and compressing air heats up, and its relative humidity plummets, because warming air can hold far more moisture, so what little moisture it carries gets stretched thin to nothing. By the time this wind reaches the foothills where people live, it has become hot and bone dry and fast. Humidity can fall into the single digits in a region that is used to living in the fog. Overnight, sometimes. Now put a spark into that. It does not matter much where the spark comes from. A downed power line whipping in the gusts. A piece of equipment. A lightning strike from weeks earlier still smoldering in a stump. In normal northwest conditions, that spark fizzles in the damp. But under a dry east wind event, that spark lands in fuel that has been baked dry at the surface, and the wind does the rest. It does not just feed the fire oxygen. It physically pushes the flame front across the land, laying the fire down flat and driving it forward, and it launches burning embers far out ahead into unburned forest, starting new fires a mile downwind before the main front even arrives. A fire under an east wind event does not creep. It runs. And it runs through the exact forests everyone believed could never burn. And this is the part that turns a bad fire into a historic one. The fuel is not just abundant. It has been getting drier for years, and there is more deadwood standing in it than there used to be. Start with the heat. The Pacific Northwest has been running hotter, and the extremes have been staggering. A few summers back, a heat dome settled over the region and pushed temperatures to levels no one thought possible there, well past anything in the record, cooking a place that most homes were not even built to cool. Heat like that does not just make a bad afternoon. It pulls moisture out of the soil, out of the dead wood, out of the living trees themselves, curing the entire landscape like firewood in a kiln. Add the long dry summers that now stretch later into the fall, and the forest goes into the windy season already parched. Then add the dead trees. Across huge stretches of western forest, bark beetles have chewed through millions of acres of timber, killing trees where they stand. Drought weakens the trees. Warmer winters let more beetles survive to keep attacking. And the result is entire hillsides of standing dead wood, gray skeletons still rooted in the ground, dried out and full of resin, waiting. It is fuel that is already dead, already dry, and already vertical, arranged like a box of matches stood on end across the mountains. And underneath all of it sits a century of a single well-meaning mistake. For 100 years, the policy across American forests was to put out every fire as fast as possible, every small burn stamped out. It sounded responsible. It sounded like protection. But in doing that, We canceled the small fires that used to clear the fuel, and we let it pile up instead. We spent a century turning the forest into a wood pile and then acting surprised when it finally caught. The fire we prevented for 100 years did not disappear. It waited, and it compounded, and now it comes back all at once. If you want proof that this combination can produce something historic, you do not have to imagine it because it already happened, and the scars are still there. Over a single Labor Day weekend, a few years ago, a powerful east wind event swept down the western Cascades of Oregon, and the region experienced the worst wildfire disaster in its modern history. In roughly 72 hours, fires exploded across the western side of the state, in the wet forests that were never supposed to burn. Around 1 million acres went up, not over a summer, over a weekend, multiple times what the state would lose in a normal full year, gone in 3 days. And it was not empty wilderness. Entire towns in the Cascade foothills were overrun. Communities like Talent and Phoenix in the south, Detroit and Gates and Blue River along the mountain highways were burned to the ground, block after block reduced to ash and standing chimneys. Thousands of homes were destroyed. Tens of thousands of people were forced to flee in the dark with fire at their backs. People died, unable to get out in time. And the smoke that poured off those fires blanketed the entire region, choking the cities of the valley below, turning the sky over Portland and Salem and Eugene a dark apocalyptic orange, and giving the Willamette Valley, for a stretch of days, some of the worst air quality on the entire planet. That was not a freak accident that can be filed away and forgotten. It was a preview. It was the West Side Forest showing everyone exactly what it is capable of when the wind turns. And the conditions that made it possible, the heat, the fuel, the dead timber, the dry late season, the east wind, are not going away. If anything, they are lining up more often. And here is something most people assume that is simply not true. They assume that when a fire like this starts, an army of firefighters can go in and stop it. Under an east wind event, they cannot. There is a threshold of fire behavior beyond which no crew, no engine, no air tanker on Earth can hold a line, and a wind-driven firestorm in century-old fuel blows straight past it. The flames are too tall, the front is moving too fast, the embers are jumping too far ahead. You cannot put water on a fire that is throwing spot fires a mile downwind of itself in gale force gusts. Aircraft often cannot even fly in that wind, and if they could, a retardant drop would be shredded and scattered before it hit the ground. So the job stops being firefighting and becomes something else entirely. It becomes evacuations. It becomes getting people out of the way of something that cannot be stopped, and waiting for the weather to change. Because only the weather can end it. Firefighters on those nights are not attacking the fire. They are going door to door in the dark, ahead of the flames, trying to wake people up and move them out before the road is cut off. The fire does not get put out. It burns until the wind finally dies or it runs out of forest to consume. And then, and only then, do crews move in to chase what is left. Everyone pictures a wall of heroes holding the line. The reality of these events is the evacuation in the dark, and a landscape left to burn itself out. That is how far outside the normal this is. The response to the worst version of this disaster is not to fight it. It is to run. The problem with these forests is that they do not come back the way a dry pine forest does. A ponderosa pine forest is adapted to fire. It expects it. Many of those trees survive low fires, and the ecosystem regrows on a rhythm measured in years. But a high-intensity fire that kills an entire old-growth Douglas fir forest is a different kind of wound. Those cathedral forests take not years, but centuries to return to what they were. 200 years. 300. When a west side forest burns this hot, you are not watching a fire that the land shrugs off by spring. You are watching the deletion of something that will not exist again in the lifetime of anyone watching, or their children, or their grandchildren. This is not a haircut. In many places, it is a clear cut written in flame. And every acre that burns makes the next fire a little easier. A dead, burned forest full of fallen snags and fast-growing brush can, within a few years, become even more flammable than what stood there before, primed to reburn before it ever has a chance to recover. Fire begets fuel. Fuel begets fire. And the loop tightens. What used to be a once-in-a-century event starts showing up once a decade, then more. The forest that regrows, if it regrows, is younger, drier, brushier, and quicker to burn. Step by step, an ancient wet forest gets converted into something scrubbier and more fire-prone, and the change does not reverse on any timescale that matters to us. And the damage does not stop when the flames go out. In many ways, for the land below, the second disaster is only just beginning, because these mountains are where the water comes from. The forests of the Western Cascades are the watershed for the whole region. The rain and snow that fall on those slopes feed the rivers that fill the reservoirs that supply the drinking water for the cities in the valley. A living forest holds that system together. The roots grip the soil. The canopy softens the rain. The spongy ground releases water slowly and clean. Burn that forest down to bare, scorched dirt, and all of it comes undone. The next heavy rain that falls on a fresh burn scar does not soak in. It runs straight off the hardened, baked ground, and it takes the loose soil, the ash, and the dead debris with it. The result is mudslides and debris flows, walls of black slurry and charred logs that come down the canyons and bury the roads and choke the streams below. That runoff pours ash and sediment into the exact reservoirs that cities drink from, fouling the water supply for communities that had nothing to do with the fire, and maybe many miles away. And it guts the rivers as ecosystems. The cold, clear, gravel-bottomed mountain streams of the Northwest are the spawning grounds for salmon and steelhead, fish that are already struggling, already central to the identity and the economy and the treaty rights of the region. Smother those streams in ash and mud and raise the water temperature by stripping away the shade. And you break another link in a chain that was already stretched thin. The fire burns for 3 days. The wound it leaves in the water can bleed for years. Then there is what all of this does to the people who live downwind, which is nearly everyone in the region. Most people in Oregon and Washington do not live in the burning forest. They live in the corridor of cities strung down the valleys. Portland, Salem, Eugene, and up north the Seattle-Tacoma sprawl. And that is exactly where the smoke goes. When 1 million acres of forest burns, it does not just consume trees. It lifts an ocean of smoke into the sky. And the same weather that drives the fire pushes that smoke straight into the population centers. Fine particle pollution. The same deadly microscopic dust that lodges deep in the lungs, spikes to levels that turn breathing outdoors into a health hazard for millions of people at once. Schools close, flights are grounded. Hospitals see the asthma cases and the heart complaints climb. And it is no longer a rare event. Across the West, a smoke season has quietly been added to the calendar, weeks each year, where the air itself becomes something to hide from. And an entire generation of children is now growing up treating a toxic orange sky as a normal part of summer. And it takes something less tangible too, something harder to put a number on, but just as real. The Pacific Northwest sold itself to the people who live there, and to everyone who ever dreamed of moving there, on an identity. Green, clean, wet. A place where you hiked through old growth and stood under trees older than the country, where the air smelled like cedar and rain, where the wilderness was the whole point. That identity is a huge part of the regional economy. It is the tourism, the outdoor industry, the reason companies and workers relocated there, the reason property in the trees commanded a premium in the first place. Now weigh that against a future where late summer means closed trails, canceled trips, and weeks of air you are told not to breathe, where the postcard forest is a burn scar, and the clean air is an orange haze, and the season people used to plan their whole year around becomes the season they try to leave. You cannot easily measure the cost of a region losing faith in its own defining feature, but you can feel it. Every year the smoke returns, the story the Northwest tells about itself gets a little harder to believe. The place is not just losing acres of trees. It is losing the thing that made it what it is, one fire season at a time. And unlike a forest, a reputation does not grow back with the winter rain. And there is one more layer to this, a slower and larger one, that turns a regional tragedy into something that reaches far beyond the Northwest. These forests are among the greatest storehouses of carbon on the planet. The old growth of the Pacific Northwest, those enormous long-lived trees packed together across whole mountain ranges, hold more carbon per acre than almost any forest on Earth, carbon pulled out of the sky and locked into wood over centuries. As long as the forest stands, that carbon stays put. It is one of the most effective natural defenses the continent has against a warming climate. Burn it, and that defense flips into a weapon. A high-intensity fire does not just kill the forest. It converts centuries of stored carbon back into smoke in a matter of hours, and pours it into the atmosphere, adding to the very warming that dried the forest out and lengthened the fire season in the first place. That is the trap closing on itself. Hotter, drier conditions make the forests burn. The burning forests release the carbon that makes it hotter and drier. A carbon sink becomes a carbon source. The shield becomes an accelerant. And every historic fire season does not just erase the forest that was there. it makes the next one, somewhere, a little more likely. So why does it keep happening? Why, knowing all of this, does the region keep arriving at the same catastrophe? Part of it is the fuel debt, the century of stored-up growth that cannot be undone in a few seasons no matter what anyone does now. Part of it is that the tools that would help, deliberately setting small controlled fires to clear the fuel, thinning the dense stands, are slow, expensive, controversial, and limited by the very same narrow windows of safe weather that keep shrinking. Part of it is that more and more people keep building homes deeper into the forest, into the exact zone where the fire and the town meet, so that every fire now threatens more lives and more property than the one before. And part of it is simply that the wind does not negotiate. You cannot thin your way out of an east wind event driving a firestorm through century-old fuel. When those days come, and they will keep coming, the forest burns on the wind's terms, not ours. And there is a quieter collapse happening alongside the loud one, the kind that does not make the news but reshapes people's lives just as completely. The insurance is disappearing. As these fires grow more frequent and more destructive, the companies that calculate risk for a living have started to do the math on the Northwest, and the math is turning against entire communities. Premiums are climbing to levels families cannot afford. Policies are being canceled or simply not renewed. In some places, coverage is becoming impossible to get at any price. And a home you cannot insure is a home you often cannot get a mortgage on, which means a home you cannot easily sell, which means the value of a lifetime of savings tied up in a house at the forest's edge can quietly evaporate without a single spark ever reaching the property. Whole towns are discovering that the financial system has quietly reclassified them as unlivable, priced for a disaster that has not happened to them, yet but that the numbers say is coming. The fire takes the houses that burn. The fear of fire takes the value of the ones that are still standing. Either way, the forest that people moved into for its beauty and its quiet is turning into a place the rest of the country is no longer willing to bet on. Dave went back inside that night, because nothing looked wrong yet. The wind was strange, the sky had a faint orange edge, and everything his whole life had taught him said that these forests do not burn. By morning, the rule he had lived under was gone, and so was the town. The forests of Oregon and Washington are still standing, most of them. The rain will come back this winter, and the moss will green, and the fog will roll in off the ocean the way it always has. And for 8 or 9 months, the region will look exactly like the wet, safe, unburnable place it has always believed itself to be. From the highway, on a gray, drizzling morning, nothing will look wrong at all. But the fuel is still stacked in the hills. The dead trees are still standing, the summers are getting hotter and running longer, and somewhere out over the high desert to the east, another dome of dry air is going to build. And the wind is going to turn around, and it is going to come down off the mountains hot and fast and empty of any moisture at all. The forest is not fireproof. It never really was. It was just waiting for the wind, and the wind is coming back.